Make a team of superheroes for Marvel. Those were the marching orders that publisher Martin Goodman gave Stan Lee. Justice League at DC had been selling, and he wanted Marvel in on the action. Lee was feeling frustrated with the comics industry and decided to just this once write a story he would enjoy reading with characters he could personally relate to with feet of clay. With collaborator Jack Kirby, together they created a unique superhero team, a loose family unit not that different from us in their interpersonal relationships, dysfunctional and loving, very human. At the same time, superhuman. In 1961, the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards, Sue and Johnny Storm, and Ben Grimm appeared on the comic stand and stepped into comic book history. We'll take a look at their debut story today on Truth, Beauty, Comics. Welcome to Truth, Beauty, Comics. I'm Levi, a cartoonist.
And I'm Felix, the guy who likes comics.
And this is the podcast where we look for transcendence in a pulpy medium. And today we're going to be talking about Fantastic Four #1 by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. And, Felix, you're more of a Marvel fan than I wouldn't say fan, but I mean, you've read a lot more Marvel, I think, than I have. I'm familiar with this story, and this is probably closest to what I've read by them. But how much did you grow up reading kind of this early, I guess, very early Silver Age stuff by Marvel?
So I've always had a familiarity with the Silver Age stuff, and Silver Age is probably my favorite era of comics. For those unfamiliar, Golden Age is like around World War II. Silver Age is 60s, and then Bronze Age is sometime later, and then people argue about what to call what comes after. So the Silver Age stuff from Marvel is really when the things that we associate with Marvel solidified, right? And so I never had a comic book shop nearby me, and so it was very much catch as catch can in terms of actually reading the comics. What happened more often was, seeing we also didn't have cable, was being at a friend's house and seeing an episode of the 90s Spider-Man, or the 90s X-Men, and just really connecting with those stories and characters, I think more immediately than Superman or Batman or Wonder Woman or any other DC characters. So I always sought out the Silver Age stuff, but it was harder to find when I was a kid. Occasionally, when I was sort of in a city at a big bookstore, I would find these Marvel Essentials lines, which were a sort of precursor to the ones that we're reading from today, the Mighty Marvel Masterworks, where it would have 20, 30 issues in black and white for like 10 or 12 bucks. And so I would sit in the store and read those. So I read a lot of them in black and white, but for whatever reason, the Fantastic Four never really stuck out to me. I was always super attracted to Spider-Man, obviously, and then sort of like every other 8-year-old boy, but also the X-Men, and Daredevil, and then later on Thor. I really love Silver Age Thor. I think it's sort of an overlooked gem. But the Fantastic Four I really didn't start reading until 2 or 3 years ago. And when I picked up, because this sort of line, so Marvel for a long time has had this line of reprints, the Masterworks, which are these sort of deluxe hardcover. They cost like $60 a pop. I would never buy any. But then they started these Mighty Marvel Masterworks, which is sort of, I think, to compete with manga. It's slimmer, and it's a bit shorter, so they're cut down a little bit, but they're still very easy to read. And the price point is like $16 for 200 or so pages of Silver Age Marvel. So
and they print pretty nice too. I appreciate that they're keeping it pretty dang close. I don't think they've done any digital alterations or something, which is something that bugs me so bad when they reprint older issues, like recolored, for modern audiences or something like that. I don't know. I just hate it. So these actually look, they're very readable.
Yeah. And so so reading this a couple of years ago when I bought it was the first time I actually encountered Silver Age Fantastic Four, and I really like it. It starts out sort of slow. I think I mean, we'll talk about some of the history in a bit, The first issue and first few issues still kind of finding their feet, I think,
Yeah.
in what they're in the Silver Age that they're kind of creating.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so that's kind of my familiarity and opening thoughts. What about you as a DC guy? When did you come to Fantastic
I
Four and the
actually,
Silver Age
yeah,
stuff, especially?
I think oddly for some reason, I mean, when you're a kid, it's just kind of whatever comics end up in your collection, I feel like is kind of what you read. So I had a whole like mini like omnibus of a run of Fantastic Four comics in the 90s when there was some scroll conflict. I would love to find what it was because I have no idea now. It's been, decades since I've lost it or, got thrown away or something, but I'd love to know what it was. I was a pretty, the Fantastic Four for Marvel was probably the, superheroes that I read the most of when I was a kid. Just because they, they had, I think, Walt Simonson was doing a run. So I remember his art before I even knew who he was, but he had a real distinctive art style that I liked. And then there was John Bryan who was drawing some of it too. And he was pretty good. So it was a pretty good era. I feel like the 90s or for Fantastic Four, maybe the late 80s, whatever was, available at my comic shop at the time. And, so the house I grew up in, I don't know if I've mentioned this before or not, but my mom she would cover over the cleavage in comics. She was very concerned about the appropriateness of, so there was, so I think, for a long time, Fantastic Four was pretty wholesome. And then in the 90s, they really decided to sex up Sue and gave her this like very over the top revealing outfit. And that was kind of the end of my Fantastic Four consumption, I think, from at that point. So I do remember that being like, my mom like saw like, nope, like we're
Yeah.
not reading this one anymore. So that kind of ended it for me when they did that redesign. But yeah.
Reminds me, my wife. So my wife has four brothers, and they're
Okay.
all super into sports, and so they subscribe to Sports Illustrated, and every year there
Right.
would be ads for a couple months for the swimsuit issue, and my wife as a kid would like go in and Sharpie over
Yep.
them. So it's a
Yeah.
grand tradition.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
But yeah, I do think that there's something sort of reading them now just as an adult. I do think there's something kind of uh, immediately kind of understandable about Fantastic Four. I think Fantastic
Mm.
Four and Spider-Man and X-Men are probably the three major Marvel figures where it's really sort of easy to identify in some way.
Hmm.
Um, right, because I mean the sort of Silver Age Marvel stuff always has a focus on human frailty, right?
Yes.
Thor's alter ego is just terrified of Jane, whom he's in love with, uh, and and the X-Men are sort of these social outcasts, right? There's a lot of approaching children with adult situations that make sense to them.
Hmm.
And I think Fantastic Four, right, fundamentally is a family.
Right.
It's always called Marvel's first family, right? Because it's the sort of first comic of the Silver Age, right? The first one that really made what we think of as Marvel. And so I do think there's something kind of immediately understandable about it, right? Like Reed is the sort
Yeah.
of slightly distant, brilliant father. Johnny is the kind of identification figure as the teenager. Um, the Thing is sort of angry about the ways that the world has been unjust to him, and Sue is kind of the mom who keeps them all together. And then
Right.
later down the line, when Reed and Sue become parents, there's sort of even more of this family dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that
So
that makes it easier to kind of approach. Which is interesting given that I wasn't that interested in them as a kid for whatever reason. I feel like they were slightly less cool, and maybe because they're a family, than something like Spider-Man.
yeah, they never seem to, maybe that was what they were trying to do with Sue's outfit redesign, but they never seem to have that kind of edgy 90s, when everyone was getting like Spawned and Todd McFarlane out, seemed harder to do with the Fantastic Four just because of their family dynamic, maybe. Yeah, they didn't have the same cachet, I feel like, that other superheroes did in the 90s. But did you're more familiar with kind of the history then of this. Did this really kick off the whole kind of Marvel model of, because Marvel, whether this is accurate to represent or not, gets a lot of credit for introducing the conflicted kind of more human characterizations of superheroes, right? And I mean, that's definitely here. Is this the one that kind of kicked that whole thing off? Is that viewed that way?
Yeah, I mean there are antecedents, right? So like in the Golden Age, there's this Namor the Submariner comic, and Namor is this like really weird figure. He's
Mm.
halfway between a good guy and a bad guy. Um, and even DC Comics, you
Right.
think of like our first episode was about the first issues of Golden Age Superman, right? And there
Mm.
is this like godlike man who isn't sure how to communicate with the girl he's in love with. Right. So,
Mm-hmm.
so there's pieces of this beforehand, and to give kind of the long answer, I think it's helpful to think a little bit about the history. So when we talk about the Silver Age at Marvel, there's three names that come up most: Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko. So Stanley,
Mm-hmm.
writer, and then the other two artists. Though there's disagreement about that, right? There's disagreement over
Yeah.
how much writing effectively Kirby and Ditko and the other Marvel artists were doing. There's one other name who is not very well known, but is worth talking about and was referenced in the cold open, Martin Goodman. So he was sort of a newspaper man, made his career publishing basically knockoffs of various competitors' pulp stories and
Yeah.
comics. Um, I found this one quotation from him that I think summarizes his view well. It's, quote, fans aren't interested in quality.
Put that on
That's a very
your
that's a very
letterhead,
different
right?
view. Yeah. That's a very different view, right, than what we're going to see throughout the Silver Age of Marvel Comics.
Yeah.
Um, so despite this approach, Goodman actually hired some very good people. Kirby, so Jack Kirby, real name Jacob Kurtzberg, was this just insanely prolific illustrator, just shocking the amount of work he would do every month for Marvel. He helped create Captain America in the 40s and uh, really was, for many, the center, the sort
Mm-hmm.
of beating heart of the Silver Age. Uh, uh, the other big hire he made was Stan Lee, um, who was actually his, I think, sister's cousin. Or no,
Oh,
sorry,
really?
sorry, not sister, his wife's cousin rather,
Okay.
and hired him basically just to be an assistant. His real name was Stanley Lieber, and this sort of young Stanley, his job was basically to like empty out ashtrays and grab more paper and pens for people. But pretty soon they started giving him small writing assignments for the comics, and he wanted someday to write the great American novel. So he wrote it under the pen name rather than being Stanley Lieber. He would write the comics under Stan Lee. And of course, this ends up becoming the household name. Uh, so Kirby and Lee worked together for a while at this company that like had a bunch of names, but eventually became Marvel. Kirby left over sort of pay disputes, where he was sort of being mistreated by Goodman's accounting because
Right.
Captain America was taking in a ton of money. And Kirby actually thought that Lee had a part in it, but Lee said he never did. And that's going to be kind of a constant theme throughout the history of Marvel Comics is Stan Lee saying one thing,
Right.
Kirby and Ditko saying something else. Um,
I
there
get the
appears.
impression
Oh yeah, go
just
ahead.
from how Stan Lee is looking at his career that he's someone who's good at taking the spotlight, and um, I'm sure. I think he's clearly a talented writer, and he knows, especially for the genre that he found himself in, he knows how to write a story that moves along. But I could also see, maybe he might not be the most fun person to work with. Maybe.
Yeah, in this one interview I saw with him, when he was telling, if memory serves, I think it was the story of how the first issue of Fantastic Four came about. It might have been Spider-Man. He said, "I've told this story so many times it might even be true." And I think that's sort of the way to take some of his accounts, um, right? Because he, over the course of his life, like Stan Lee became more than just him. It also became this
Right.
figure who has a cameo in
Yeah.
dozens and dozens of Marvel movies. Uh, yeah, but I do think so. There's some people take these sort of extreme views, where either like Stanley is this great genius and Kirby and Ditko are just sort of guns for hire. I think anyone who's looked at their art is who thinks that is insane.
Right. Yeah.
Um, but then on the other side, there's also people who think that Lee was this sort of master manipulator, and effectively everything good about Marvel Comics came from really Kirby, bit of Ditko, and then a bit of the other artists.
Hmm.
And Lee was just kind of taking credit. I think this is also kind of ridiculous, and is made most obvious if you try to read Ditko's stuff that he wrote himself.
For sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
we won't go any more into that today. Um, anyway, and I think one thing that's worth mentioning, I'm trying to remember. I think in a previous episode we touched on this figure, Frederick Wortham, who wrote a book, "Seduction of the Innocents," which basically
Yes.
there were a bunch of comics in like the 50s, a bunch of crime and horror comics, like uh, crime in huge letters and stories called
Right.
Please Not
Yeah.
Pay, and it's these stories of
Yeah.
like gruesome murders and stuff,
Yeah.
and
Really
theoreticals about
schlocky
how bad
pulp
crime
stuff.
is. Yeah. So this guy, Frederick Wortham, he was a psychologist or psychiatrist of some sort, and wrote a book arguing that comic books lead to juvenile delinquency. And this, led to comic book burnings and congressional hearings. And comic book publishers were really concerned that comics were going to be outlawed.
Hmm.
So they banded together and made the Comics Code Authority, which is sort of
Right.
analogous to the old Hays Code for films, where it had, some of it was pretty sensible, right? If these are going to be aimed primarily at children, so like don't show the criminals as being these wonderful people or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, but it was also restrictive in various ways. Right? You just couldn't have werewolves for like 15 or so years. You couldn't
Interesting.
have vampires. There were a bunch of these things. You're right. It was really restrictive. And there had to be, right. The heroes had to have some sense of decency.
Right.
And I think this is actually a big part of what makes the Silver Age tick, because superhero comics had become much less popular, in part because of the ascendance of these crime and horror comics, um, but also because the genre was feeling a little played out. But I think part of the genius of Silver Age Marvel is working within the code, yet having a very strong sense of human drama, and
Hmm. Yeah.
and even human interiority, uh, in a way that allows you to have heroes, right? Superheroes trying to do good, but with an emphasis on the trying, right?
Right.
And an emphasis, on what it is to live as a hero in ways that are identifiable not just for kids but also for older readers.
Right.
Like Marvel comics in this period became super popular on college campuses, and like Stan Lee would get invited to various universities to give talks about it. Um, and this was at a time when there was still some kind of lingering distrust of comics. I mean, there's always lingering distrust of comics, but there was particularly strong one because of Wortham.
Right.
Um, yeah, and so this, yeah, I think that's a big part of kind of the genius.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
can see the impact because it really seemed like very quickly DC caught on, and there's a real strong different a very noticeable difference between DC Comics in the '60s versus DC Comics in the '50s. Which and I do love DC Comics in the '50s. I love um, how they're goofy, they're silly, but they really do lack a lot of internal drama and internal conflict. Um, it's just kind of wacky and goofy. I mean, I guess you could say I feel like the best representation of that is like the '60s Adam West Batman show, which is actually a very good representation of just the the seriousness of comics at that point, and so this even this clearly had a huge impact in the way that Stan Lee, Kirby, and Marvel were writing, because by the '70s, DC is totally in that, what is it, the famous Green Lantern, my ward is a junkie or whatever, it's like they're dealing with
Oh yeah,
drugs,
yeah.
or all this kind of, all these social issues. They're trying to deal with racism and all this kind of stuff that they just, seem to have absolutely no interest in before Marvel started, coming on the scene with this kind of stuff.
And I also think Marvel has always done it much better. And part of this
Right.
is because, um, with the exception basically of Captain America, all of their characters were sort of founded on this, like they were
Mm-hmm.
birthed in this time, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, with the exception of Batman, all all the major DC characters are really like imagined as these kind of shining heroes right from the beginning, as
Yep.
kind of gods among men, right? As the kind of Zack Snyder
Mm-hmm.
line about them, uh, right? And Batman is sort of strange because in some ways he's more like a pulp character than he is like
Yeah.
a comic book
Superhero. True.
superhero.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that's part of why Batman is and has been for decades the best-selling superhero comic, because it's like the one that was able to do that.
Yeah.
And kind of make that transition. Um, I also think that DC. I haven't read enough DC to back up this claim, but my sense is DC has never really understood why the Silver Age Marvel comics worked so well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Because are these comics more likely to kind of tackle political issues with this kind of mid-century soft liberalism than any DC comics at the time? Sure, but like they're not they're not sort of pushing the envelope for its own sake,
Yeah.
right? And you don't read them at no point when you're reading even a kind of one that would maybe seem slightly like edgy or something because of like racial politics or something.
Yeah.
Um, it's not it's not an attempt just to be edgy, right? There's a very
Yeah.
full story, and there's
Yeah.
really human characters.
DC's when they do this kind of stuff, it feels like on a very special episode of Superman today.
Yeah, yeah.
It feels really ham-fisted, whereas
Mhm.
it comes a lot more naturally to, I think, Marvel, just the writers, and maybe that's Stan Lee. I don't know. I do wonder. I think it's kind of a mystery exactly how much he wrote versus Kirby. I suspect, just off my gut, because I've read a lot of actually Kirby's DC stuff, and to me it seems like Kirby's wheelhouse is the wild, like psychedelic, these bizarre, kind of almost, you know avant-garde hippie stories that he would make, and I mean, his run on Jimmy Olsen with like New Gods and just all this kind of stuff is a trip. It's really fun to read, but it's wild. Whereas Stan Lee, I don't know, he seems much more that this. if I were to guess, I would say he definitely contributed a lot to that kind of, working class superhero kind of stuff.
Yeah, I get the sense reading Kirby's Marvel stuff that what he takes real joy in is like depicting things that are interesting.
Yeah.
Is one,
Yep.
and then like particularly monsters, the bad guys,
Mm-hmm.
and fights.
Yep.
Like those are the things.
Yeah.
Um, and and I mean we should also sort of mention for people who don't know about the so-called Marvel method of comic writing. Um, so DC at the time, as I understand it, the writer would produce a full script, and then the artist would draw it basically, and he might ask for changes or anything, but that was basically how it
Mm-hmm.
worked. And then a letterer would come in, letter it, and a colorist would color it, then all done. Um, but in part because Stan Lee was writing almost everything that they were putting out for many years, basically he would say, "Hey Jack, for the next issue of Fantastic Four, that's Boston,
Mm-hmm.
not New York, but whatever. I'm not going to do a Lee accent anymore.
You're from New York. You
Um,
should know these things.
I'm from upstate. Upstate's
Okay.
very different.
Different place.
But ours, we have more in common with the Canadian accent and culture
Okay.
than the Queens of the Bronx. But
Okay.
but anyway, he would say, like, let's have a monster that goes through walls or whatever, and
Right.
Johnny would be angry about this, and Ben would be blah blah blah, and it'd just be and we like don't have records of this, right? And so
Mm.
uh when Stan Lee describes it, he describes it as, talking to him for 15 minutes. And when Kirby describes it, he describes it as saying two sentences.
Mm.
And presumably the truth is somewhere in the middle there. Um,
Right.
I I also expect that it varies a bit story to story, right? Because there are references from uh, artists at Marvel of Stan like getting up and jumping up onto his desk and sort of gesticulating about what's going on, and I don't imagine him doing that for a two sentence
Right.
description. Right, and so the artist would then go and draw the whole story, send it back to Stan, who would then write the dialogue,
Mm.
and then it would get lettered and colored.
Yeah.
And so right, that means that the artist is much more involved in the storytelling, and particularly after having covered Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, uh, it's really apparent um, how good a storyteller Kirby is,
Mm-hmm.
particularly um, because there are some. So, like for instance, the Thor comics of this period will like switch between Kirby and Don Heck, and Don Heck is really good. I like Don Heck. I think he's underrated. But there are certain sort of storytelling things that Kirby does with the comic that it's not as though Stan Lee was saying, this panel do this panel do this, and this panel do this, which will show this
Right.
kind of motion and bring the idea of this and this and this. Um, right. So there's clearly a kind of storytelling brilliance that uh, Kirby in particular has. In
Yeah.
some ways, I actually prefer Ditko's work. There's this like weird gawky style that just,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with Spider-Man, just like it
Yeah.
works.
It's a good fit.
But like there's this kind of storytelling power that Kirby has that he can't have gotten from Stan Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically, you can do that. That kind of that method works really well if you have a lot of talented people. And it sounds like Martin Goodman just got really lucky with who he managed to hire, because he had certain. And I love DC artists. I especially love Kurt Swan, who's a major DC artist. But there's just no denying that Kirby and Ditko are some of the best that you know the last 100 years. So I mean, when you have those guys, this stuff reads so much more. It's so much more fun to read than even the stuff that DC was putting out at the time, which just feels very stiff and kind of boring in comparison.
Yeah. There's this excitement and energy to it consistently.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of regardless of the illustrator, actually.
Mm-hmm.
There's this sense of momentum
Yeah.
that even the kind of less, let's say, brilliant artists bring to it. So yeah, just before we kind of jump into the story, I just want to think about what it is to come to this cover, right? To
Mm.
come to this like kind of awkward in retrospect, right? We look at this and the first speech bubble that comes to our eyes is Sue Storm saying, I can't turn invisible fast enough. How can we stop this creature, Torch? Right? And like turning invisible, it's not clear in any way what help in this
Right.
situation. She's like
Yeah.
15 feet off the ground being picked up by this monster. Um, Johnny Storm as Human Torch. Just wait and see, sister. The Fantastic Four have only begun to fight. Ben Grimm, the Thing. The three of you can't do it alone. It's time for the Thing to take a hand. And then Mr. Fantastic, like, looking super weird. I mean, he's stretched out, right? He has these kind
Yeah.
of Plastic Man style powers, but he's all stretched out and looks weird. It'll take more than ropes to keep Mr. Fantastic out of action. Um, right? Like, the dialogue's actually
Yeah.
terrible in that movie.
It is. Yeah.
Really, really bad. After I've been praising Lee's dialogue. But, right, remember, this is right after, or pretty soon after, Comic Code Authority, right? In the upper right-hand corner, approved by the Comic Code
Mm-hmm.
Authority. So you're not getting horror comics. So you're not getting monsters like this one month after month. But you come to this issue, right? And Marvel at this point is mostly putting out like romance comics and westerns and things like that because those are selling well. Um, but there's like with so many things at Marvel, there's two stories of how it happened. So one is very boring, that Kirby had worked on this series, Challengers from the Unknown, that was about like four scientists who went on adventures. And it's kind of forgotten and is not considered that good. I mean, it's good insofar as Kirby is really good, but like the story is not that interesting.
Yeah.
Um, and he came over to Marvel, and while he was back at Marvel, he said, "Hey, let's do it. Like Goodman wants to do a team, so I'll just sort of use that and make it a little more sciency and space age." Really boring story. Stan Lee's story, much better, right? Which is that Martin Goodman was playing golf with somebody from DC, and DC had started the Justice League of America recently and told him the sales figures, and he was just blown out of the water by this, and he got back to the office and told Stan Lee, we got to make a team book, we've got to make a superhero book, and it's got to be a team book.
Right.
And Stan Lee was just at the end of his rope and had been thinking about quitting, and he talked about quitting for years and years and years, but he'd like had to fire almost all the staff twice. He just had this miserable experience, and he's at home kind of complaining to his wife and saying, I think I'm gonna quit. Like this is just miserable. I don't want to do a stupid superhero book. Like I'm sick of writing. Like I want to write the Great American Novel, or I want to like have a job that's not this. And his wife said, "Well, I mean, if you're thinking about quitting, why don't you just write the story the way you want to? Like write it like the Great American Novel.
Yeah.
Write
Yeah.
the best you can. Pour yourself into this." Um, and thus was born the Fantastic Four. Much better story. Um, my tendency is to think Stan's is more accurate actually
Mm.
than Kirby's, even though in a lot of other stories I sort of take Kirby's side. That one just sort of has more of the ring of truth, and that there was a kind of unintentional influence of Challengers of the Unknown, that like this is a team
Yeah.
with four people on it that he's done before and it's going to have similarities. But people of good faith disagree on this. But right, like you just imagine, because we read this first chapter, first issue, and like it's kind of messy.
Yeah.
It's immediately apparent that brilliance is being born in the way that, like, I think when you read the first issue of Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy, it's
Mm-hmm.
like this is wow. Um, uh, but like when you think about sort of this cover coming to this, like you haven't been seeing many monsters, and you've got monsters and a family, and as we get into like human drama, even
Yeah.
if they're uh it's not nearly as compelling human drama as it will be even in like 10 issues time, let alone by the time they're doing Spider-Man and other stories. Yeah, anyway, I just kind of wanted to say this. I think the cover is worth kind of focusing on. Is there anything kind of as an artist that jumps out to you about the cover?
Yeah, I think it's a great composition to me, because I always think about this, especially with um, you know, this is one of the things I love about the Silver Age, and kind of comics of this era. Up until, I mean, and I hate about modern comics is the cover tries to give you like, it's like a real teaser for the story. In modern comics, they do all these variants now of just random artists, with very comparatively boring covers to me, compared to what they used to do. So this is very typical of the time, and I love this genre of cover where it's like the whole goal seems to be like, what the heck is going on here? Like, I got to figure this out. It's like a little preview, a teaser trailer for the content of the comic. Um, and you see this all the time when it's like, oh no, Superman has to eat 100 hamburgers a minute, otherwise he'll die, and like, it's these crazy things where someone's like, and you're like, whoa, I have to figure out, what is this? And they,
Yeah.
and true to the form, this never happens actually in the comic. I mean, this scene never appears. I don't know why I
Yeah.
don't know who, the no monster breaks through Manhattan, and they don't all have this encounter, but it's more of kind of a like general summary of where this comic is going, almost like
Yeah.
a vision statement for it.
Yeah.
And true to Jack Kirby's style, I think um, Kirby is also someone who's inked really well generally, and he looks really good when inked by the right people. And it seems like, um, Marvel really understood how to ink his stuff well, because it's good. It's got good design. It's got a good layout, and it's just the right amount of detail and mixture of heavy lines versus some shading and textures. I think it's a really strong cover, and it rightfully kind of a classic.
Yeah, I know it is striking whenever I go into a comic shop. Um, the covers don't it's rare that a cover grabs me.
Right.
Right? I mean, it happens occasionally, but most of the time it's just here's a character.
Yep.
You know, and it's sort of like what are they doing? What's their context? Why should I pick up this issue as opposed to any
Mm-hmm.
other? Right? And I think part of it is the change in sort of business model that
Yeah.
it's not that you're a kid at the grocery store and you see 15 comic books and you are allowed to buy one this week. It's you're a 35-year-old guy with a fair bit of disposable income and you're reading like 8 or 10 series and you read them every month.
Yep.
Uh, or 80 series as it may be. Um, and you're going to be buying them no matter what the cover is. And for some reason, if they have a bunch of variant covers, you're going to buy all those variant covers. Um, it's really not clear to me how the contemporary superhero comic economics work, but whatever. Um, yeah, I do think there's, even when it's art that I like, right? Even when it's an artist I like
For sure.
doing art that I think is cool, it very rarely feels like a cover.
Mm-hmm. It
Um,
doesn't. It. I
yeah,
guess the thing it doesn't do is ever really tell a story anymore. Like this
yeah,
tells a little story. It's in one big page, or at least it yeah. There's some kind of it's a teaser for the story in some way, and
yeah,
and more what the modern kind of comic cover seems to be is just like, it's a work of art designed to catch your attention, but it has hardly any bearing on the story inside. Um, and some of it's, some of them are very good, like on their own, but you could pull them away from the story and never, have any connection to it.
yeah. All right, so we start with the actual story.
Yeah, let's go for that.
Okay. The story begins in media res with the team responding. to a mysterious flare signaling an emergency that's very reminiscent of the bat signal.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And they kind of come together. And that's sort of the first part, right? There's kind of three parts. And the first part is
Mm-hmm.
really just showing these are the four characters, right? Here's this, what's the order of them? I think, here's this
Sue starts
Sue, this turning invisible, and then the thing being
the
this
thing.
giant kind of rock monster. Johnny, insanely,
Yeah.
working on a car, sitting inside of it, seeing the symbol, and then instead of walking, like
That.
walking 1 foot away, just flames on
Yeah.
and destroys the roof of the car
The entire
and
car.
flies out
Yeah.
of it. Actually, yeah, no, it is the entire car pretty much
I
that
mean,
destroys.
so while we're talking about this opening, to me, this is at once really good and hilariously bad at the same time because,
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
yeah, the Fantastic Four behave like total psychopaths in this situation.
Yeah.
And Reed needs to get a way better way of getting in contact with them because they almost, it gets to the point where they shoot a nuke at Johnny that could, you know, I don't know if they didn't know how destructive nukes were at the time, but it could have destroyed the entire city if they didn't catch it and throw it out to sea. So, they behave totally insane. Like to get to respond to this summons that he issues. And at the same time, I think, I put myself in the seat of, assumedly Stan Lee, and this is actually a really great way to introduce the characters, as for a kid who's picking up a story and wants to read it. It's the old rule, show don't tell. um he shows you learn reading this, there's a mission, they have to get somewhere, and they use all their powers to get there, and you learn like, oh wow, so Johnny's this guy who can fly, and he can fly faster than jets. He gets hot enough to melt a car. The thing is really strong. He can tear apart. He's almost invulnerable. So you're learning about it, and not to rag on DC, but they had all kinds of superhero teams at the time, the Legion of Superheroes, all this stuff, and the way they would introduce them was always like, be Superman flying along and like, gasp, another boy flying next to me. I thought I was the only person who could fly. And it's like, that's not true. I'm lightning lad and I can use, or magnetic lad, and I can use the power of magnetism to levitate myself. And I do like this really cheap montage of like, this kid lifting cars or something like that, and it's like, and that's my powers, everyone, and it was very rote and kind of stiff. So this is very good, but it's also kind of like, it's kind of funny when you step back and actually look at what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. So flashback then reveals the origin. And this I think is the strongest part of this issue by a ways. So Reed, this brilliant scientist, has an ambitious space exploration plan that goes awry when cosmic radiation bombards their ship. Though they survive the crash, they soon discover that they have powers. This brings both wonder and turmoil. Ben particularly struggles with his monstrous transformation because unlike all the others, right? So Sue can turn invisible, and she'll develop later other powers later, but she can turn invisible. Johnny can fly, and his entire body can be engulfed in flame. Reed can stretch to unimaginable lengths, but all of them can act like normal people. They can look like normal people. They have control over their powers. Ben has just turned into this rock monster, and that's just what he is for the rest of his life. So this, I think, kind of sets the stage for some of the personal and even moral complexity that Lee is introducing into comic superhero-dom. But anyway, despite their challenges, they agree to band together as a team, united by their shared experience and Reed's vision to use their powers for the greater good.
Yeah.
So that section really, I think, is pretty is relatively strong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is, where Kirby's artwork, it's a good story, but he just has a knack for picking the right perspectives. I feel like, say when they're going out, he chooses to have like, a wide shot of the rocket, then close up on the faces, reacting, and he knows how to put together dynamic layouts. Even I even feel like I like his artwork a little bit more than later Kirby, where he got so dynamic and he would get almost too abstract sometimes. It's a little more restrained, but he just has a real storytelling knack. And one of the things I want to call out too, while we're just talking about the artwork that I love, is you really see this, and I especially noticed this reading later, like kind of the John Hickman run in prep for a future episode. But there's something about modern, kind of staff cartoonists, I feel like, where, for example, every single guy looks exactly the same. They're all these jacked, vaguely, model looking dudes. Um, and it gets really hard to they distinguish them by the color of their hair is effectively how it works. But I think one of the strengths Kirby has that we didn't mention is his character design. Johnny, Reed, and Ben, before they have any kind of transformation, look very different from each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the funny things about Kirby is sometimes he draws faces really weird to me, and but he always draws faces that look like very distinct. He's a very good character designer, I guess I'd say that, where he knows how to create different looking people that just kind of stick in your head and are distinct based on the way they look.
Yeah, I think particularly on the point of character design, I think this is one of those instances where limitations really help excellence to develop.
Mm-hmm.
I think, right, of how now we have these amazing microphones with sound design that we can control really, really well. And when you watch movies on your TV, you can't hear them and you need the subtitles on, right? Like, and
Yep.
Chris Nolan just like, kind
Yeah.
of basically brags about this, and says like, oh yeah, like you can't hear most of Tenet.
Yeah.
Uh, right. And that's kind of an extreme example, but uh, there are just scenes, right? I mean, it's something like 70% of Gen Z watches TV with subtitles on now. And part of that's because
Yeah.
they're looking at their phones, whatever. But a big part of it is sound design in a way that, like, movies in the 40s, people enunciated clearly and spoke, and the emotion came out very, very clearly. And,
Right.
did that mean there was certain subtlety that you couldn't do? Yes. But it also meant that there was a kind of clarity. And I think that's true also with art, right?
Mm-hmm.
So our printing technology, the printing technology we use for superhero comics now is really, really good. Um, but this limitation meant that you needed to be able to just glance and see, okay, here's this young buck Johnny, and here's the sort
Mm-hmm.
of big guy Ben, and here's Reed, this kind of sturdy adult guy, but not like a thug the way that Ben kind of is. Um, right, and you just look and immediately know, because
Yeah.
you don't know how, because it's not being printed in a super detailed way. B, you don't know how much of that detail is going to be lost in the printing process for a given issue anyway, and so
Yep.
you have to. Um, yeah, and I think there is this kind of, I don't want to say laziness because sometimes because it takes a lot of work, obviously. But in most contemporary superhero comics, there's this, they put the onus onto the reader to
Yeah.
sort of know, oh, okay, well, like you can't really see this person well, but like from the context, they're probably this character who last appeared 48 issues ago.
Right.
Um, right. Whereas here it's,
Yeah.
you pick it up, you're 8 years old, you understand it. And I get that there are certain positive things that can be done as a result of these changes. Like I think when done well, long arcs are amazing. Long
Mm.
stories that take a while when done well. The problem is that everyone thinks they need to do a long arc, and a lot of them are not done well.
Right.
Um, and between like a poorly done singular story and a poorly done drawn out story, I would rather have the short one.
Right. I mean, and even just visually, I think and we can discuss this a lot more when we get to the Hickman run. But there's just so many moments where I did not understand what was going on, just from a like, wait, what's happening? Like, you look at a panel and I'm just like trying to um, visually understand what's happening. And then from kind of like transitions to understand, okay, wait, now they're in a spaceship. Like, I didn't see them get into that spaceship. Where are they? Or something like that. There's a lot of just like the abundance of the technology is not helping clarity of that. And you never,
Yeah.
and here, there's so much more limited, but it makes it so much easier to, and I've read comics all my life, I'm an adult. Um, I still am struggling to understand what the heck is going on,
Yeah.
whereas here I look at this and it's like, there's so much clarity, even, breaking things down to like 3 colors in a number of the panels. They're optimizing for clarity as opposed to, giving anything close to a realistic color scheme or
Yeah.
consistency.
Yeah.
But it just reads really well to me. And
Yeah.
it looks, um, in small doses. Like, this panel always has stuck in my mind, that when that whether we've all changed, all of us, we're more than just human. It's like them silhouetted against a fire. It's a tiny little panel on a page, but visually, that's
Yeah.
like, it's such a strong panel, and every one of these are, um, compared to a lot of just like the noise that seems to be in modern kind of comic art.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, right? Because I think to return to kind of the length of storytelling, I think one of the difficulties with a lot of contemporary superhero comics uh, is how bound up with continuity it is.
Yeah.
And it's I'm not anti-continuity, right? But um, so to take an example from TV show that I reference a fair bit, Doctor Who. So Doctor Who had 26 series running from the 60s until the 80s. And then it was canceled, and then it came back in 2005. Uh, it was still the same show. It was still the story of the same guy. He just has the power to regenerate, and so you recast the main actor. Um, s- Spoilers for the end of the third season of the revived series from 18 years ago or whatever.
Right.
This character, the Master, comes back. He was this iconic character from the original show. Um, if you've watched it since the 60s, you know all this history and you're coming to it with that. If you're a 10-year-old, you you know like right away it's another Time Lord who survived the death of the protagonist, the Doctor's planet, and he's evil, but they used to be friends.
Okay.
And that's all you need to know. You know it. You know what I mean? You know it like within 2 minutes of when he's introduced without a lot of kind of clunky exposition. Um, and then you can watch this sort of great season finale 3-part epic, and you get it. Uh, Whereas even with so like for instance, I really like the Hickman run on Fantastic Four, but like first time I was reading it, I literally would read a volume or a few issues, and then I would go on YouTube and watch Comics Explained talk about like, okay, and Franklin's powers were taken away because of this at this time, and his dad doesn't
Okay.
realize he's coming back, and blah blah blah. Or, oh, this figure from the Inhumans, in this event comic 4 years before had blah 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 blah. None of that is explained in the comic itself, in the text itself. There's this need of prior knowledge that right. I think the Doctor Who example is really helpful because there's a lot of continuity there, and it gets referenced, it gets used, but not in a way that alienates people who haven't spent
Right.
years and years following this
Yeah.
and spent lots of money on DVDs or comics or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that a writer who's talented and who works really hard can figure out how to avoid using continuity in a way that hurts their story.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a challenge. I
yeah,
think, yeah, I think every probably writer struggles with this. I remember one of the funny examples is J.K. Rowling. at the first issues of Harry Potter, she would try to give a little summary of what happened. If you were just
Oh yeah, the
picking it up
first
for the first
chapter
time.
is always like kind
Yeah,
of weird and
yeah,
boring if you've read the
yeah,
ones before.
exactly. Harry's best friend Ron, who and then Hermione, who was
Yeah.
always she'd give these little summaries of the relationships, and then she just gave up on that at I think around like book 4 or 5. There's a definite point where she just stopped trying to summarize all that
Yeah.
came before, because Harry Potter had become so ubiquitous. It was in the consciousness.
Mhm.
Everyone knew the
Mhm.
relationships at that point. But and I'm sure it's just not fun creatively to try to backtrack and summarize everything. But as
Yeah.
there's a balance that has been lost in modern comics for sure.
And it's a simpler setup, but I think Carl Barks, who had some episodes about his Scrooge and Donald Duck comics, um, is just a master at this, where in the first page you understand the characters and
Yeah.
their relationships. And they're not saying, hello, my Uncle Scrooge, who is my uncle and miserly,
Right.
but is fabulously wealthy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you're
It
right.
works, even though it's like a very childish in certain ways comic. I think Barks just did this masterfully. He would set the stage,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think that's something, right? Stan Lee had this dictum that he would always use, which was that every single book we put out might be someone's first comic book,
Hmm.
right? Not first
Yep.
Marvel comic, not first issue of Fantastic Four. They read first comic book,
Hmm.
right? There might be an eight, or actually almost certainly everyone pretty much was, right? Because everybody
Yeah.
has this story of, oh yeah, like my first issue was this about this and this and this, right? And for a very long time, this was practiced really well, even if occasionally kind of clunkily.
Right.
Um, but this was something that mattered. It was sort of, you can approach this, you can pick it up, you can read it, even multi-part stories. Um, yeah. Anyway, we're going off on a little bit of a tangent now, because we're on the first issue of this,
Yeah. Let's talk
60
about this
year
more
old
when we get
stories.
to
But
the Hickman run, because I think
yeah,
it'd be
yeah,
interesting to
yeah.
compare.
Yeah. Um, do you want to summarize the next part?
Yeah, so this is kind of the monster of the week, I guess you could say, for the Fantastic Four. But they follow they're summoned by Reed. That kicked off the whole story. The summons. He explains why he called them there. And this line always cracked me up, where he goes, he says, "I have some pictures to show you," and Ben goes, "What are they, pinups?" And I was like, "What if they were pinups? That would be so bizarre." Like, yeah, I got these amazing pinups, Ben. Come here. Like, sorry, I just almost
Come on,
destroyed the
my
city.
fiance.
Yeah, exactly. Um, but so they follow a trail of kind of mysterious disasters that Reed has been monitoring, collapsing oil wells, power plants, to a place called Monster Isle, this kind of legendary mythical place, where they confront the Mole Man and his sinister plan for taking over the world. Um, and the Mole Man is this kind of tragic character. He's kind of strange looking person. He was rejected by society for his appearance and eccentricity. And he went beneath the earth to find solace, but found this great power and used that to kind of like build this destructive vendetta. And the conflict reaches this peak when the Mole Man unleashes these monsters, his minions, to attack the team. And each member uses their unique abilities to fend off the creatures. Um, and they defeat the Mole Man, and they don't kill the Mole Man, but they just are kind of like, yeah, just he'll stay under the earth. He's kind of learned his lesson, I felt like, but he retreats further into the underground realm, sealing himself off. But leaving open the possibility of future conflict with him. What did you think of kind of the first villain that they encounter?
I mean, having read lots of other comics and lots of other Marvel comics, it's bad. It's not very good.
Right.
Not having, right, picking it up at the time, um, it's okay.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Right? Like,
Yeah.
because it's, like, it's very exposition heavy. It's, um, they just sort of win. Um, they just sort of fly off. Like, there are a couple images that are great. Like, on the final page, I mean, it's ridiculous, right? So on this final page, there are 7 panels. First panel, they're running away from the monsters. Second panel, excellent panel, shows all the monsters.
Yep.
Third panel, Johnny single-handedly and single-panelly defeats them.
Right.
And then there's, one panel of them running away, one panel of them already on the plane. I mean, you talk about already being on the spaceship. Then
Yeah.
one panel of them flying away from the explosion, and one panel of them looking stone-facedly into the future. Like,
A lot
that's
happens.
bad
Yeah.
storytelling.
Yeah.
Like that's just bad storytelling. Right, and it's clear that like they're sort of making it up as they went along, and also that Kirby was probably drawing 2, maybe even 3 other comics that month.
Mm-hmm.
So like it, but at the same time, like uh, the the sort of first and third parts, when read in context of the middle part, where
Mm-hmm.
you have the origin of the Fantastic Four, I think does elevate it a bit. And the Mole Man is a kind of striking figure. He
Mm-hmm.
is a simultaneously kind of lame and cool superhero, supervillain, with a backstory that is relatable and understandable. Yeah, I mean that's sort of all I have to say about this part. I don't have anything
Yeah.
sort of that thought provoking here.
Yeah. It is funny now that you mention it, because they've been building up to this massive monster who appears on the cover, and then in kind of the splash of this one. Um, and when he shows up, he's in for all of 2 panels, and he's pretty easily apparently defeated. They don't even show him. It's just Johnny flying around and confusing him, and then it's like they kind of forget about him, or I don't know. Do you just go run away or something? We don't see what happens
And
exactly.
I'm a big defender of the narration box, and I think oftentimes many of my problems with contemporary superhero comic storytelling could be solved by just having little narration
Mm.
boxes sometimes. I mean, judiciously used. Uh, but this is lazy. This
Right.
is Here's an image of the monsters that says what's going on, and then here's an image that doesn't show the monsters of Johnny flying around being on fire that describes how he won.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
that's why people don't like caption boxes.
Yeah. Well, in this it's funny too, because the one where it shows Johnny flying around, this is it's actually not very typical of the rest of this comic, because this is how DC would, this was standard DC stuff where they would narrate what they were doing. Like, or have an inner monologue of gasp. They're using the invisible ray, which I'm not, which affects me in this way, and whatever. It's just hilarious when you actually say like, why are you saying this? We know this. You don't have to, but it's this way of like exposition that no one would say. Which generally they're actually pretty, the dialogue in here is pretty good at avoiding that. But that is definitely an instance where he's going, this will cause a rock slide, sealing us off from those creatures. Like, thank you, Johnny. Thank you for explaining why you're doing this to no one in particular. But yeah, it does actually really seem like it's like they ran out of time or paper or something like that. Like, because there's
Yeah.
the fights before this are a lot more drawn out. There's a monster that the Thing fights, and there's everyone kind of gets a chance to fight it. But when the big bad shows up, he gets like 2 panels, and it's like rushed to wrap the thing up.
Yeah, you kind of imagine he was told he had, 35 pages, and then he got to page 24 and said, "Oh, actually, you have 25."
Yeah,
It's
or
just
something like that. Yeah,
yeah.
it feels that way for
Uh,
sure.
we've I think surpassed the hour mark by a little bit. Are there is there so this is the beginning of this great epic, and in a way, and also the beginning of, I believe still, but maybe not, the longest writer artist. I know it's one of the longest writer artist collaborations in superhero comics history. I'm trying to remember if I think Bendis and what's his or her name might have beaten it with Ultimate Spider-Man. But I think Kirby
Obviously
and
less memorable
Lee.
than Lee and Kirby. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the art. I mean, I like Ultimate Spider-Man a lot, but it's for the writing.
right.
Um, the art is fine. The writing is amazing. Um, and I feel like maybe Claremont, but like
Mm,
I mean, I don't know. But anyway, they did something like 120 issues together, and they worked together amazingly. But this is sort of the beginning of them trying to do this new thing.
yeah.
Um, in terms of like content, there's fantastical violence and uh, like a nuke being shot. Nothing that like your average 12-year-old would have any issue, or average 10-year-old would have like any issue with.
Yeah.
It's not anything tough. Um, so I would this per, this particular issue I wouldn't necessarily recommend as like the best thing in the world, but this like first 10 issues in this $16 book, I would recommend very widely. Buy it yourself, read it,
Mm.
get it as a gift for every 10-year-old you know. Just really great.
Yeah,
Really
I
fun. Yeah.
really I think the thing that I would say about this entire volume, including this issue, is it's very readable. It's easy to sit down, enjoy, and there's fun to be had here, which is more than can be said for a lot of comics these days. It's hard just to
Yeah.
pick up and casually read. So yeah, this volume in particular, I agree. I would say it's a good gift for a youngster, or if you just feel like reading some comics yourself and getting familiar with the series. That's not going to take a ton of homework to understand the backstory.
Mm.
Yeah.
So next episode we'll be continuing our journey with Fantastic Four, and we'll be reading issues 4, 5, and 6. So we'll be talking about Namor the Submariner and Doctor Doom. If you enjoyed this episode of Truth Beauty Comics, there are 3 things you can do for the podcast to support it. The first is to keep listening and tell your friends to listen to us.
And the second is to review the podcast, giving it 5 stars, please, on whatever you use to listen to podcasts. And the last thing you can do is consider contributing to our Patreon with a monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can get perks like access to exclusive episodes, voting on upcoming episodes, and even an original drawing from me. But most of all, you can help make this podcast sustainable.
That's the end of the episode. You can reach us at truthbeautycomics@gmail.com or on our social media accounts. Thanks for listening. Remember to take comics seriously and have fun while doing it.